3 people were murdered in Cabin 28. 3 boys in an adjacent bedroom were found unharmed. Tina Sharp was missing. Her remains appeared near Feather Falls 3 years later. April 1981 found Keddie, California, a small resort community among the trees of Northern California. Sue Sharp was living in rented Cabin 28 with her children. It was a temporary home, with the ordinary demands of family life, in a place that seemed quiet from the outside. On an April morning in 1981, Sue Sharp's daughter returned to Cabin 28 and found Sue, 15-year-old John Sharp, and John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate murdered. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. Authorities located 3 unharmed boys in the neighboring bedroom. Later accounts differ about what one boy may have seen or heard. Investigators therefore could not assume that all 3 slept through the attack or shared the same memory. 2 emergencies began at once: preserve a homicide scene and find a missing child whose last confirmed location was the cabin. The distinction between an unharmed child and an unaware child is critical. The first was observed when authorities entered. The second makes a claim about sleep, hearing, and memory that later accounts dispute. Treating all 3 boys as having slept through the night creates a false locked-room puzzle. Their survival is extraordinary, but it does not prove how sound traveled or what each child experienced. Tina's disappearance was not a side detail to the killings in Cabin 28. It changed the emergency investigators faced. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate had been found dead, while 12-year-old Tina was missing from the same household. 3 boys were found unharmed in a neighboring bedroom, but later accounts differed about what one may have seen or heard. Authorities had to protect traumatized children, preserve a homicide scene, and search quickly for a child who might still be alive. Those demands competed from the first hours. Every decision about interviews, access, and movement around the cabin could affect either the search or the evidence. Cabin 28 became both a murder scene and the starting point for Tina's search. Detectives needed to document physical evidence, identify everyone present, and establish a timeline without assuming the surviving boys shared one experience. The adjacent bedroom identifies where they were found. It does not prove silence, sleep, or ignorance. Tina's absence created a second track. Investigators needed to learn when she was last seen, and whether any physical trace connected her disappearance to the 3 deaths. Those questions overlapped without yielding a reliable sequence. Early investigators also had to keep Tina's status open. She might have escaped, been taken, or been elsewhere before authorities understood the scene. Search decisions made in those first hours could not rely on knowledge gained 3 years later. That temporal limit matters when reviewing the case. Her later recovery confirmed a 4th homicide, but the initial response began as a combined murder investigation and urgent attempt to locate a living 12-year-old. Searchers in 1981 could not begin with the knowledge supplied by Tina's recovery in 1984. They had to consider escape, abduction, injury, or movement elsewhere and deploy resources accordingly. That uncertainty is important when judging the first response. A later homicide finding clarified the outcome, but the initial duty was to search as though a missing 12-year-old might still be found alive. Before the victims became names in reports, they were a family and a friend, spending time in a rented cabin. Sue Sharp, 36, was raising her children there. The home had to work as a home. Children slept in different rooms. Friends came and went, and familiar routines gave the family structure. John Sharp was 15. Dana Wingate, 17, was John's friend. Dana's presence meant the violence reached beyond the Sharp family and into another family's grief. Tina was 12. She was young enough to need adults around her, but old enough to move through a home she knew. A person who knew the cabin might know which rooms children used and when the household was likely to be asleep. It is only a possibility, not evidence. Still, that possibility shows why investigators could not treat Cabin 28 as an anonymous address. The people who lived there had habits, relationships, and a shared sense of what was normal. Once the killings were discovered, even those ordinary details became questions. Who was expected to be in the cabin that night? Who knew where the children slept? And which pieces of familiar routine could help explain the violence without unfairly turning closeness into suspicion? The first hours also required different kinds of urgency. A murder scene benefits from controlled access and slow documentation. A missing child response demands fast movement across roads, woods, neighboring cabins, and possible travel routes. Tina's unknown status forced both at once. Every person sent outward to search was one more person moving near evidence, yet delaying the search could cost a living child. That conflict shaped the investigation before anyone knew a fourth homicide had occurred. The boys' survival is one of the case's most striking facts, but it does not supply a complete reconstruction. They survived without injury in the bedroom next door. Reports concerning one boy's possible observations changed over time. Investigators, therefore, had to distinguish initial statements from memories recorded years later, after family discussion and publicity could influence recall. That does not make every later detail false. It means each claim must be tied to when and how it was recorded. The fixed point is limited. 3 boys survived inside the cabin while Tina disappeared. Accounts from traumatized children require context. An initial statement may be shorter than a later memory, and later interviews can be influenced by repetition, family discussion, or publicity. That does not make every later detail false. It means claims must be tied to when and how they were recorded. Keddie retellings often merge those versions into one confident scene. The documented case is less tidy and more responsible. Investigators developed suspects and received leads involving people close to the victims. Proximity mattered in a small community, where neighbors might know who visited a cabin, which relationships were strained, and who understood a household's routines. It still did not amount to a verdict. Detectives had to compare names and statements against physical evidence, timelines, and records. Later teams inherited that work along with another burden, determining whether evidence collection, labeling, storage, and interviews had preserved enough context for new examination. Improved laboratory methods can test an item that survives. They cannot restore a lost label, an unrecorded conversation, or a lead that was never pursued when memories were fresh. A useful timeline separates what was known in 1981 from evidence located later. Original investigators had the cabin, victims, surviving children, missing person search, physical traces, and early statements. Later teams inherited those materials, plus the burden of determining whether collection and storage had preserved them. New technology cannot repair a missing label, an unrecorded interview, or a lead never followed. It can only test what reaches the laboratory with enough context. Keddie was a resort community in Northern California, with rental cabins set among the trees. It was not an abandoned settlement or a house at the edge of an empty wilderness. People lived nearby. Families stayed in cabins. Visitors came and went for ordinary reasons. That setting changes how the case is understood. A resort cabin carries an assumption of shelter. You close the door, settle in for the night, and expect the people around you to be neighbors, guests, or friends. Cabin 28 turned that assumption on its head. The unsettling part was not simply that the cabin stood among trees. It was that a violent crime could occur within a community where people and homes were nearby, yet the full story remained hidden. Someone might notice a person arriving or leaving without knowing why it mattered. A sound could be heard and understood as part of normal life until later events gave it a different meaning. This is the detail that changes the atmosphere of Keddie. The setting was not frightening because it was completely cut off. It was frightening because closeness did not guarantee knowledge. Cabins, families, and visitors could exist within the same small community, while essential facts passed unnoticed between them. Cabin 28 showed how little people may know about what happens behind a familiar door. Later investigators revisited physical items and early suspect information with techniques unavailable in 1981. A renewed lead still has to survive the history of the item itself: who collected it, where it was stored, whether it was contaminated, and how confidently it can be linked to the scene. Keddie did not lack names or theories. It lacked a chain that could convert those possibilities into a charge strong enough for court. The first response forced a painful balance. A missing child search demands speed along travel routes, nearby roads, woodland, and surrounding cabins. A homicide scene demands controlled access and methodical documentation. Tina's unknown status required both at once. The surviving boys also needed safety and care, while holding possible fragments of the timeline. Forceful questioning could deepen trauma. Delay could make memory harder to evaluate. Investigators had to make those choices before anyone knew that Tina had also been killed. 3 years later, her recovery changed the meaning of the morning, but could not retroactively change decisions made while authorities were still searching for a living child. Evidence handling became part of the case itself. Physical items, reports, interviews, and recordings only help later investigators when their origin and custody remain clear. In Keddie, records and handling problems weakened attempts to connect promising leads to a charge. A concrete example emerged when an anonymous call recording associated with Tina's recovery was found years later in an evidence box. The tape had survived, but the delay reduced the chance to identify the caller or test the information while memories and locations were fresh. Time did not make every old clue meaningless. It raised the burden of proving what each item was, where it came from, and what conclusion it could still support. 3 years after Tina disappeared, her remains were found in the Camp 18 area near Feather Falls in neighboring Butte County. The 1984 recovery confirmed a fourth homicide and established a second location. It did not show who moved her, which route was taken, or when she arrived there. Investigators could search the area and compare it with known people, vehicles, and earlier leads, but years of weather and public access limited what the site might preserve. The discovery ended hope that Tina had survived while leaving the offender and the movement between Cabin 28 and Camp 18 unresolved. The 1984 recovery transformed Tina's status from missing child to homicide victim. It also gave investigators a place that could be searched for associated objects and compared with known people or vehicles. 3 years of weather and public access limited what the area could preserve. The site answered one devastating question for the family, while leaving the offender and movement between counties unresolved. Once Tina's remains had been found, the morning at Cabin 28 had to be read differently. At first, the missing child might have seemed like an emergency, unfolding alongside a murder investigation. 3 years later, that absence could no longer be treated as a temporary uncertainty. It was part of the violence itself. That changes the meaning of the cabin. The separate room where the other children survived was a boundary. The violence did not reach them in the same way, though it occurred only feet away. The adjacent bedroom was no longer merely a difficult detail for investigators. It may help explain why accounts of the night were so fractured from the beginning. The information about members of the victim's circle also became harder to dismiss. Proximity did not establish guilt, but it raised troubling questions about knowledge of the household and access to the cabin. And the compromised evidence carried an added weight. It did not affect only the 3 people found inside. It also weakened the search for answers about Tina, whose disappearance had already taken the case far beyond Keddie. Re-examination does not solve Cabin 28. It gives its earliest details a sharper edge. Events once treated as separate begin to resemble one damaged chain, with each broken link making the next answer harder to reach. The second location widened the number of records investigators needed to compare. A person familiar with Plumas and Butte counties, a vehicle capable of moving between them, and knowledge of the Camp 18 area could all become leads. None was proof without a trace or statement tying it to Tina. Geography narrowed an exaggerated mystery while preserving the central one. How did she leave Cabin 28 and arrive near Feather Falls? Tina's recovery forced investigators to connect 2 different settings, a family cabin in Plumas County and the Camp 18 area in neighboring Butte County. Familiarity with the region, access to transportation, and knowledge of secluded places could guide leads, but geography alone identified no one. The second location widened the records and people that needed comparison while providing no reliable account of the route. It confirmed that Tina's disappearance belonged to the violence without revealing how the offender moved between the 2 places. Keddie contains many suggestive details, but no single clue carries a conclusion. 3 boys survived in a neighboring bedroom. Tina was recovered near Camp 18, and investigators developed suspects and physical evidence. Later reviews also confronted problems in records and handling. The anonymous call recording gives that failure a specific form. Information could exist inside an agency, yet fail to guide timely work if investigators could not locate or connect it. A recording found years later cannot be pursued with the same immediacy as a live call. Voices change, people die, and locations are altered while the object waits in storage. Later reporting identified one concrete handling problem. A recording of an anonymous call connected to Tina's remains was located years afterward in an evidence box. That example is more useful than a broad claim that every part of the investigation was chaotic. A lead can exist inside an agency and still fail to guide work if later investigators cannot locate or connect it. Reviews of Keddie have therefore had to evaluate both what evidence said and what happened to it after collection. John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Sue Sharp were murdered inside Cabin 28. 3 boys in the neighboring bedroom survived, while accounts of what one might have observed evolved across the years. Tina Sharp disappeared and was found 3 years later near Camp 18 by Feather Falls. Leads focused on people known to the victims, but proximity did not prove guilt. Problems in evidence handling weakened later review, including the delayed discovery of an anonymous call recording connected to Tina's recovery. The file contained many names and theories, but no preserved chain strong enough to connect them to a charge tested in court. The anonymous call recording illustrates the cost of lost context. A caller reportedly connected information to Tina's remains, but a delayed recording loses the urgent investigative value of a live call made while records and memories remain fresh. With passing years, voices, people, and places all change. Preservation kept the object alive. Delayed discovery weakened what investigators could do with it. Camp 18, near Feather Falls, lies in Butte County, which neighbors Plumas County. That geography places the second location within the region, not at an impossibly distant destination. Investigators still needed a person, vehicle, trace, or statement linking Cabin 28 to the recovery area. Tina's remains supplied one endpoint without revealing the route between them. A child vanished from a cabin where 3 people were murdered and was found in another county 3 years later. No charge has joined those events into a court-tested sequence. Camp 18 was not an impossibly distant place, disconnected from the original investigation. It was near Feather Falls in the county next to Plumas. That geography narrows the mystery to a regional movement, while leaving its mechanism unknown. Investigators still needed a person, vehicle, trace, or statement linking the cabin to the recovery area. Tina's remains supplied the destination point. They did not supply the route. No prosecution has established who killed Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. Investigators developed suspects, collected physical evidence, and received leads, while later reviews confronted problems in handling and records. A recorded anonymous call related to Tina's discovery eventually surfaced inside stored evidence, a concrete example of how a clue can exist without guiding timely work. Keddie endures because later investigators must ask 2 questions at once. What does each item show, and how its custody unfolded after collection? The surviving families have waited decades for evidence strong enough to answer both. Later investigators inherited more than old evidence. They inherited the history of every item and decision made since 1981. A laboratory result has value only when the tested material can be linked confidently to the cabin, a victim, or another relevant location. A statement has value only when its timing and circumstances are known. Keddie's unresolved status reflects that accumulated burden. New examination may strengthen a lead, but a prosecution still requires a chain that survives challenge from collection through the claimed conclusion. Cabin 28 endures because it confronts a difficult truth. Danger can come through familiarity, and evidence can fail the people who need it most. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina were not symbols of an unsolved case. They were people whose families deserved clear answers. Keddie also leaves a warning for every investigation that follows. Evidence must be protected early, records must be clear, and uncertainty must never be dressed up as proof. When those safeguards fail, time does not heal the gap. It can widen it. Justice depends on what people choose to preserve when the truth is still within reach. The families lost 4 people, and then watched uncertainty grow around evidence that might have helped explain why. That history makes restraint essential. Naming a familiar suspect, merging conflicting childhood memories, or exaggerating distance between counties can make the case sound cleaner without making it truer. The durable facts are already devastating. 3 murders in Cabin 28. 3 boys found alive nearby. Tina missing. Her remains recovered 3 years later, and no person convicted for any of the 4 deaths. Subscribe to Grim Inquiries for more documented cases where evidence matters more than rumor.